The storm didn't just bring snow that night. It brought something that wasn't supposed to survive it. The wind clawed across the open fields like it had teeth, dragging needles of ice against the metal siding of Caleb Hayes' barn until the whole structure groaned in protest. And somewhere beyond the fence line, something heavy slammed once, then went still, as if the storm itself had decided to hold its breath. Caleb stood at the edge of his porch, collar pulled high, boots already sinking 2 inches into fresh powder. The thermometer nailed beside the door reading -18 degrees Fahrenheit, and dropping, the kind of cold that didn't just freeze pipes. It erased mistakes and buried them by morning. He should have gone back inside, should have saved what little propane he had left, should have pretended he hadn't heard anything at all. But the sound came again, softer this time. Not metal, not wind, something uneven, like breath breaking in the middle, and Caleb exhaled slowly, fog curling in front of his face. Before stepping off the porch and into the storm, the snow swallowed sound as he crossed the yard, each step crunching sharp beneath his boots, the beam of his handheld light cutting a narrow tunnel through the white, catching the fence, the frozen irrigation lines, the half-buried tractor, until it found something darker near the barn door, something that didn't belong to the land or the machines. At first he thought it was a tarp torn loose, twisted and half covered in snow, but then it shifted, barely, and Caleb stopped cold, the light trembling. Just enough to reveal a shape curled around something smaller, protective even in collapse. He moved closer, slower now, boots dragging through drifts that reached his calves, and when the beam settled fully, the world seemed to narrow to that one impossible sight. A woman, if she could be called that, her skin a muted blue beneath frost, her limbs drawn tight around a small bundle pressed against her chest, both of them trembling in shallow, fading rhythm. The barn door beside them hung crooked. Its latch snapped from the outside, as if someone had locked them in and left them to the night, and Caleb's jaw tightened without him realizing it. He crouched carefully, the cold biting straight through his gloves as he brushed snow away from the smaller shape, revealing a child. No older than a few years, skin the same strange hue, lips pale, breath barely visible, and for a moment Caleb just looked, his mind catching up to what his eyes were telling him. This wasn't local, wasn't human, wasn't anything that belonged out here on the edge of a forgotten farming grid. The woman stirred then, just enough for her eyes to open a fraction, something faintly luminous flickering in them as they locked onto his face. And her hand moved weakly, not reaching for help, but pulling the child closer, shielding it even from him. Caleb swallowed, the wind howling louder behind him, pushing snow into his back, urging him toward the door, toward warmth, toward the simple, safe decision of walking away. His gaze flicked once toward the house, barely visible through the storm, then back to the 2 figures pressed against the barn, and he let out a slow breath that seemed to carry more weight than the cold itself. Yeah, he muttered under it, voice rough, almost lost to the wind. This is a bad idea, but his hands were already moving, shrugging off his outer coat, dropping it over both of them, the fabric darkening as frost melted against it. And without waiting for permission, without asking a single question, Caleb Hayes reached down into the storm and chose not to leave them there. Caleb did not remember crossing the yard, only the weight, the sudden and unmistakable weight of 2 bodies pressed against him as he lifted them from the snow. The smaller one barely more than a bundle in his arms while the woman remained rigid even in weakness, her grip refusing to loosen from the child, and the wind surged harder as if it noticed his choice and objected. The barn door banged once behind him as he forced it shut with his shoulder, cutting the worst of the storm into a dull roar, and for a second he just stood there in the dim interior, breath coming fast, the air inside only a few degrees warmer, but already feeling like mercy compared to outside. The overhead light flickered when he hit the switch, casting a weak yellow glow over hay bales, rusted tools, and the old livestock stalls he had not used in years, and he moved quickly now, boots scraping across the concrete floor as he cleared a space near the corner where a portable heater sat idle, its fuel gauge hovering just above empty. "Do not make me regret this," he muttered under his breath as he set the child down first, careful, easing the small form onto a folded tarp before turning back to the woman, who had not taken her eyes off him even once, her expression not pleading, not grateful, just watchful. measuring. He dragged the heater closer, hands stiff from cold as he twisted the valve and struck the ignition, the first click, failing, the second catching with a low whoosh that filled the space with a wavering orange light, and slowly, almost reluctantly, the air around them began to shift, the kind of warmth that did not feel strong but felt like a promise. He shrugged off the rest of his coat and laid it over the child, then hesitated before reaching for the woman again, stopping just short when her hand moved, weak but deliberate, placing itself between him and the child, a barrier drawn even now. Caleb exhaled, long and steady, and instead of pushing past it, he adjusted the coat so it covered both of them, then leaned back on his heels, giving her space. "You keep that up. You are both going to freeze anyway," he said quietly, not unkind, just stating a fact, his voice carrying through the hum of the heater and the muted storm beyond the walls. Her eyes flickered, something shifting behind them, and for a moment he thought she might speak. But no words came, only a shallow breath that trembled at the edges. Caleb pushed himself to his feet and moved toward the workbench, grabbing an old thermos, unscrewing the cap with stiff fingers and checking what little coffee remained. Still lukewarm, still something, and he poured a small amount into the lid before setting it within reach, but not too close, always leaving that gap, that choice. The child stirred first, a faint sound, more instinct than voice, and Caleb watched as the woman's entire focus snapped to it, her posture tightening, her hand moving with what strength she had left to pull the small body closer, shielding, protecting, the same motion he had seen once before years ago in a hospital room he did not like to think about. He looked away from that memory and back to the present, to the flickering heater, the rattling barn walls, the two figures slowly thawing in a place that was never meant to hold anything like them. And he realized something simple and inconvenient at the same time. This was no longer just about getting through the night, because the moment he had brought them inside, the storm had stopped being the only thing he needed to worry about. The heater clicked softly as it struggled to hold its flame, a thin ribbon of warmth fighting against the cold that still clung to the barn walls. And Caleb stood there for a long moment watching the two of them as if they might disappear the second he looked away. But they did not. They only breathed, uneven and shallow, the child first, then the mother, each breath a fraction stronger than the last. He moved carefully back toward them, slower now, less like a man reacting and more like a man deciding, lowering himself to one knee again as he reached for the thermos lid he had set down, the faint smell of coffee rising with the steam that barely showed in the dim air. "It is not much," he said, voice low and steady, placing it a little closer this time, still within her reach but not forcing it. "But it is warm." And he watched her eyes track the movement, the way her focus shifted from him to the cup, then back again, weighing, calculating, as if every small choice carried consequences he could not see. The child stirred once more, a soft sound escaping that was more instinct than language, and that seemed to be the deciding factor, because the woman's hand finally moved, slow, deliberate, lifting just enough to reach the edge of the lid, her fingers trembling as they closed around it. And for a second Caleb thought she might refuse even now, but instead she brought it close, not to herself, but to the child, tilting it carefully so a few drops touched the small lips. The effect was almost immediate, not dramatic, not sudden, just a subtle shift, the child's breathing smoothing slightly, the tension in the small frame easing by degrees, and Caleb let out a breath he had not realized he had been holding. "Good," he murmured, more to himself than to her, before pushing back to his feet and turning toward the shelves along the wall, his mind already moving through what little he had left to spare, rationing without writing numbers down, calculating warmth the same way he usually calculated fuel and time. Behind him, he heard a sound that made him pause, not loud, not sharp, just a voice, faint and strained, speaking in a language that rolled differently than anything he had heard before, the cadence unfamiliar, the tone guarded even in weakness. And he turned slowly, not stepping closer, just enough to meet her gaze. Again, she said something else, shorter this time, and he shook his head slightly, one hand lifting in a small, open gesture. "I do not understand," he replied, keeping his tone even, simple, like talking to someone who needed clarity more than answers. Her eyes narrowed for a moment, then flicked toward the child, then back to him, and she tried again, slower. Each word pressed through effort until one of them shifted into something his old translation unit, mounted by the barn door and half forgotten, suddenly picked up with a faint crackle. The device buzzed, hesitated, then produced a broken, mechanical echo of her voice. You risk for us, why? And the question hung there between them, thin as the heat in the room, but heavier than anything else that had been said. Caleb rubbed a hand over the back of his neck, glancing once toward the door as the wind rattled it again, then back at her. And for a second, he looked like he might give a long answer, something complicated, something that explained more than the moment required. But instead, he just shrugged slightly, the movement simple, almost tired. Because you were outside, he said, and there was no speech in it, no lesson, just a fact, delivered the same way he would talk about weather or broken machinery. And something in her expression shifted again, not trust, not yet, but not the same distance either. And in the quiet that followed, broken only by the soft hum of the heater and the storm losing its edge. Beyond the walls, the space between them felt a little less like a line and a little more like something that might, eventually, be crossed. The heater settled into a steadier hum, its small flame holding now, pushing back the cold inch by inch as the air inside the barn shifted from sharp and biting to something that could almost be called livable, and Caleb moved with quiet purpose, pulling an old canvas tarp from the wall and laying it down thicker beneath them, then dragging a crate closer to act as a barrier against the draft that slipped under the warped door. He worked without asking, without explaining, each motion deliberate, practical, the kind of care that did not look like kindness at first glance, but revealed itself in the details, in the way he angled the heater so the warmth reached the child first, in the way he checked the distance so it would not burn too hot, in the way he paused every few seconds to listen to their breathing, as if it were a gauge he could not afford to ignore. Behind him, the woman shifted again, her movements still weak, but no longer fading. And when he turned back, he saw that she had adjusted her position, no longer curled entirely inward, one arm still around the child, but the other braced lightly against the floor, as if she was testing the ground beneath her, testing whether this place would hold. The translation unit crackled once more, catching fragments of her voice as she spoke again, slower now, shaping each word with care. This place yours. And Caleb nodded once, simple, yeah, before adding, farm, because that seemed like the only explanation that mattered. Her gaze moved across the barn then, taking in the worn beams, the patched wiring, the tools that had seen better years, and something in her expression softened, not with comfort, but with recognition, as if she understood what it meant to hold on to something that barely held together. The child made a small sound again, stronger this time, and Caleb crouched down just enough to check, not touching, only observing, the faint color returning to the small face, the breath no longer breaking in the same uneven rhythm, and he allowed himself a brief nod, more relief than satisfaction. He stood again and walked to the side table, grabbing a dented metal bowl and a sealed packet of nutrient mash he kept for emergencies, tearing it open with his teeth before pouring it in and adding a bit of warmed water from a can he had set near the heater, stirring it slowly until it reached a consistency that would not shock a fragile system. And when he brought it back, he did not hand it over. He placed it down between them. Always that space. Always that choice. The woman watched him closely, her eyes no longer sharp with suspicion, but still far from trust. And when she reached for the bowl, she hesitated just a fraction before lifting it, bringing it to the child first again, offering small amounts with careful precision, each motion guided by instinct that needed no translation. Caleb leaned back against a post, arms crossing loosely as he gave them room, his gaze drifting for a moment toward the barn door where the wind had begun to ease, the sound no longer a constant assault, but a fading presence, and with it came a different kind of silence, one that allowed other thoughts to surface. He glanced at the control panel near the entrance, at the blinking indicator that showed an external scan had passed through the area earlier, faint, distant, but real, and his jaw tightened slightly as he looked back at them, at the fragile pocket of warmth he had created in a place not meant for shelter. The woman noticed the shift, her eyes following his for a second before returning to him, and this time when she spoke, the translation unit caught more of it. They search. And Caleb did not ask who they were, did not ask why. He only gave a small nod, the kind that said he understood enough, and then he pushed himself off the post, moving toward the door to check the lock again, reinforcing it not because it would stop anything determined, but because it was something he could still control, and in a night that had already changed too much, that small control mattered more than he cared to admit. The storm eased sometime after midnight, not all at once but in pieces, the wind dropping from a constant howl to something that brushed along the barn walls like a tired hand, and in that quieter space the small sounds began to matter more, the steady hum of the heater, the faint crackle from the translation unit, and the soft, uneven breathing that was slowly finding a rhythm. Caleb sat on an overturned bucket a few feet away, elbows resting on his knees, hands loosely clasped, not watching them directly anymore, but not looking anywhere else either. The way a man watches a fire that he cannot afford to let go out. The child had shifted closer to the warmth, small fingers curled around the edge of his coat, as if it belonged there. And the woman had adjusted with her, no longer holding so tightly that it looked like fear, but not letting go either, a balance that spoke of something learned the hard way. For a while, no one spoke, and that silence did not feel empty, it felt like a pause, like the kind that comes after a long day when words are no longer needed to explain what is already understood. Caleb reached behind him and pulled a second blanket from a crate, one he had been saving for the worst part of winter, and without ceremony he stood, stepped forward just enough, and draped it over the edge of their space, not touching them, just adding another layer between them and the cold that still lingered in the floor. The woman watched the motion closely, her eyes tracking his hands, and when he stepped back again, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not gratitude exactly, but acknowledgement, and that was enough. The translation unit clicked again, catching a fragment of her voice as she spoke softly to the child, the words still mostly lost, but the tone clear, low and steady, the same tone Caleb had heard once before in a different place, in a different life. And he found himself looking down at the small metal keychain that hung from his belt, turning it once between his fingers before letting it fall back against his leg. He stood after a moment and walked to the far side of the barn, checking the fuel line on the heater, tapping the gauge with a knuckle, watching the needle barely move. And he did the math again in his head. Hours left. Maybe less if the temperature dropped again. Maybe enough if the wind stayed down. And he glanced back at them, at the way the child had settled into a deeper sleep, the tension gone from the small frame, the breathing now steady, and something in his chest tightened, not with worry this time, but with recognition. He turned off one of the overhead lights to conserve power, leaving only the low glow from the heater and a single bulb near the door, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor, softening the edges of everything. And in that dim light the barn looked less like a place for machines and more like something that could hold people, even if just for a night. The woman shifted again, slower now, lifting her gaze to meet his, and when she spoke, the translation unit caught more of it this time. The words clearer, less broken. You stay, why? And Caleb let out a quiet breath, leaning back against the wooden post behind him, his shoulders settling as if the question had been waiting there all along. He considered giving a better answer, something that explained the past he carried or the reasons he had stopped asking certain questions. But instead he shook his head slightly and said, because leaving you alone would have been worse. And he left it there, simple, unpolished, the kind of truth that did not need anything added to it. She studied him for a long moment after that, not searching for weakness this time, but for something else, something he could not quite name. And then she looked down at the child again, her hand resting lightly over the small form, no longer shielding, just there, present. Outside, the wind faded further, the night settling into a stillness that felt almost unnatural after hours of noise. And Caleb remained where he was, not moving closer, not stepping away, holding that quiet space between them as if it were something fragile, something that, for the first time since he opened the door, did not feel like a line that needed guarding but like a distance that might, if given enough time, disappear on its own. The night stretched thinner toward morning, the kind of quiet that did not feel peaceful so much as suspended, like the world was waiting to see what would happen next, and Caleb had not slept. Not really. Only shifted his weight now and then, eyes closing for a few seconds before opening again at the smallest change in sound. The heater clicked lower, its flame steady but weaker, and he pushed himself up from the post with a slow exhale, crossing the barn to adjust the valve, squeezing a little more life out of the remaining fuel, even though he knew exactly what that would cost him later. When he turned back, the woman was watching him again, but something had changed in the way she held herself, her shoulders no longer drawn tight, her posture more upright despite the exhaustion that still lined her face. And for the first time since he had found her, she did not look like she was expecting him to take something from her. The child stirred between them, a small hand slipping free from the coat and brushing against the rough canvas beneath. And Caleb stepped closer without thinking this time, not stopping at the edge of that invisible line, but kneeling just enough to gently pull the blanket back over the small arm. His movements careful, measured, the kind that came from habit rather than hesitation. The woman did not stop him, did not raise her hand this time, and that absence of resistance felt louder than anything she could have said. The translation unit buzzed faintly as she spoke again, her voice steadier now. Name you. And Caleb blinked once, then gave a short nod. Caleb, he said, tapping his chest once, then gesturing lightly toward her in return, leaving the question open without pressing it. She hesitated, just a fraction, then answered, the unit struggling for a moment before catching enough of the sound to shape it into something close. Sarah, and she shifted her hand to the child, adding a second word more softly. Nomi, and the names settled into the space between them. Simple, human in the way they were shared. Even if nothing else about the moment was, Caleb nodded. Again, as if that completed something important, and he leaned back slightly, resting his weight on one knee as he glanced toward the door where a faint gray light had begun to press against the gaps in the wood. The first sign that the night was finally giving way. The air felt different too, less sharp, the kind of cold that still lingered but no longer threatened to take everything with it. And with that change came a new tension, quieter but heavier, because morning meant visibility, and visibility meant questions he did not have answers for. Sarah followed his gaze, her eyes narrowing slightly as she sensed the same shift, and when she spoke again, the words came more clearly this time. When light, they find. And Caleb let out a breath that held no surprise, only acknowledgement. Maybe, he replied. Not denying it, not confirming it, just placing it where it belonged, somewhere outside his control. He pushed himself to his feet and walked to the far wall, grabbing a length of old insulation and wedging it along the bottom of the door to block the remaining drafts, then checking the latch again, more out of habit than belief, before returning to the center of the barn. He paused there, looking at the two of them, at the way Nomi had shifted closer to the heat, at the way Sarah's hand rested lightly over her now without the tension that had been there before, and he realized that whatever happened next, whatever came with the daylight, this moment right here had already changed something that could not be undone. He moved back to his place near the post, but this time he did not sit all the way down, remaining half standing, as if ready to move if needed, his eyes tracking the slow rise of light along the edges of the barn walls. And in that quiet, with the storm gone and the world beginning to wake beyond the fields, the space between them felt smaller than it had at any point during the night, not because it had been crossed, but because neither of them seemed to need it as much anymore. Morning did not arrive all at once. It seeped in through the cracks of the barn like something cautious, pale gray light replacing the darkness inch by inch until the shapes of the world returned with quiet clarity, and with it came a stillness that felt heavier than the storm ever had. Caleb noticed it first not by sight, but by sound, or rather the lack of it, the wind gone entirely now, leaving behind a silence so complete that even the soft hum of the heater seemed too loud, and he straightened slightly where he stood, his attention shifting outward, beyond the barn, beyond the small circle of warmth he had built. Sarah felt it too, her body tensing in a different way than before, not from cold, but from awareness, her eyes moving toward the door as if she could see through it, as if she knew something was coming long before it arrived. Nomi stirred between them, letting out a small, confused sound as the light changed. And Caleb moved without thinking again, adjusting the blanket, his hand lingering just long enough to make sure the warmth held before he pulled back. Then it came, faint at first, a low vibration that did not belong to the land, not to the wind, not to anything natural, a distant hum that grew steadily stronger, not loud, but precise, controlled, the kind of sound that carried intent. Caleb's gaze snapped to the control panel by the door, the indicator light blinking once, twice, then holding steady in a pattern he had not seen in years, and his jaw tightened as recognition settled in. Yeah, he muttered under his breath, not surprised, just confirming what he already knew. And he moved quickly now, crossing the barn to kill the overhead light entirely, plunging the space into the softer glow of the heater alone, reducing anything that might draw attention from the outside. Sarah watched him closely, understanding without needing the translation, and she pulled Nomi closer, not in panic, but in readiness, her movements sharper now, more deliberate, the weakness from earlier replaced by something steadier, something that had been waiting beneath it all. The hum grew closer, resolving into something distinct, not one craft, but several. Their presence felt more than seen, hovering just beyond the barn walls, and Caleb exhaled slowly, running a hand once through his hair before turning back to them. For a brief moment, he considered saying something, explaining, asking, but none of it would change what was already happening. So instead he simply walked toward the far side of the barn, to the trapdoor built into the floor beneath a stack of old feed crates, and he shoved the crates aside with controlled urgency, revealing the reinforced hatch beneath. He looked back at Sarah then, meeting her eyes fully for the first time since the night had begun, and there was no distance left in that look now, no line to hold, only a choice. Down there, he said, voice low but firm, tapping the hatch once before stepping back to give her space, not forcing, not dragging, just offering. Sarah did not hesitate this time. She shifted Nomi into her arms and moved toward the opening, her steps unsteady but determined, and as she reached it, she paused just long enough to look at him again, something unspoken passing between them, something that did not need translation, before she lowered herself carefully into the darkness below. Caleb closed the hatch over them, pulling the crates back into place with steady hands, then stood there for a second, listening, the hum outside now directly overhead, the barn creaking softly, as if it felt the weight of what hovered above it. And he let out a slow breath, turning toward the door as the first shadow passed over the narrow strip of light beneath it, knowing that whatever came next, he had already made his decision long before the morning arrived. The hum outside did not fade. It deepened, settling into a steady presence that pressed down on the barn like a held breath, and Caleb stood near the center of the floor, still, listening as the faint crunch of boots on frozen ground approached the door, slow, deliberate, not rushed, not chaotic, just certain. The latch rattled once, not from force, but from a precise external scan that passed through it, a thin blue line of light slipping along the edges of the frame before disappearing, and Caleb did not move to stop it, did not reach for anything. He only waited. The door opened a few inches on its own, then wider, letting in a slice of pale morning light that cut across the floor and stretched toward him, and in that light stood figures he recognized without needing to see their faces clearly, their silhouettes defined by clean lines, controlled posture, and equipment that did not belong to farmers or settlers. One of them stepped forward, not aggressive, not hesitant, just exact, and a voice followed, filtered but calm. We are conducting a search, and the words carried no urgency, only expectation. Caleb tilted his head slightly, his expression unchanged, and gave a small nod as if the statement required acknowledgement more than response. Yeah, he said, voice even. I figured. And he shifted his weight just enough to lean casually against the post behind him, placing himself between them and the deeper parts of the barn without making it obvious. The figure paused, as if evaluating him, then continued. We are tracking 2 individuals who entered this sector during the storm, and the phrasing was careful, neutral, but the intent behind it was not, and Caleb let out a slow breath, glancing once toward the open doorway where the light revealed untouched snow, no visible tracks leading in, no sign of anything unusual beyond the ordinary aftermath of weather. Storm covered a lot, he replied, shrugging slightly. If you are looking for something, you are a few hours late. And he kept his tone steady, not dismissive, not defensive, just factual. The way he spoke about broken equipment or missed deliveries. The silence that followed stretched just long enough to feel intentional. And then another figure stepped forward, raising a small device that emitted a soft pulse, the kind that scanned rather than searched, sweeping across the barn in a slow arc, passing over tools, walls, and finally the floor, lingering for a fraction longer near the stacked crates that hid the hatch. Caleb felt that pause like a shift in pressure, subtle but unmistakable, and he straightened just slightly, not blocking, not reacting too quickly, just enough to make it clear that he was present, that this was his space, his ground. "You live alone out here?" the first voice asked, tone unchanged, but the question carried more weight than the words themselves, and Caleb nodded once. "Just me," he answered, then added after a beat, "and a heater that is about to quit if I do not get more fuel," letting a trace of irritation slip into his voice, the kind that came naturally to a man interrupted during something practical. The device emitted one last pulse, then lowered, and for a moment it seemed like the decision hung in the air, balanced between suspicion and dismissal. And then the figure inclined its head slightly, a gesture that could have meant anything. "If you observe anything unusual, you will report it." And Caleb gave a short nod. "Sure," he said, as if the request meant nothing more than routine, as if the ground beneath his feet did not hold a secret that could change everything. The figures turned without further comment, stepping back into the light, the door closing behind them with the same quiet precision it had opened, and the hum outside began to lift, not vanishing, but receding upward, pulling away from the barn inch by inch until the weight of it finally eased. Caleb did not move right away. He stayed where he was, listening until the last trace of that sound faded into the distance. And only then did he let out a breath he had been holding far longer than he realized, his eyes dropping briefly to the floor where the crates sat undisturbed, the silence returning once more, but this time it was different, not empty, not waiting, but full of something else entirely, something that felt like the moment just before a truth decided to reveal itself. Caleb stood there a moment longer after the last trace of sound vanished, the silence settling back into the barn like it had never been broken. But he knew better now. Silence could mean safety, or it could mean the pause between two decisions, and he moved slowly, deliberately, stepping away from the post and toward the stacked crates, as if the ground itself might shift if he rushed. He crouched and slid the top crate aside, then the next, revealing the outline of the hatch beneath, and for a second he just rested his hand against the wood, feeling the faint warmth that still lingered there, proof that they were still below, still waiting, still trusting something they had no reason to trust. He lifted the hatch carefully, the hinges giving a soft creak that sounded louder than it should have in the quiet, and a thin ribbon of warmer air rose from below, carrying with it the steady rhythm of breathing. Two patterns now, one small, one measured. Sarah looked up first, her eyes adjusting quickly to the light as she searched his face for something that would tell her what had happened, what had changed, and Caleb gave a small nod, the kind that carried more weight than words. "They are gone," he said, voice low but certain, and the tension that had been coiled through her shoulders eased just enough to be seen. He stepped back as she climbed out, one careful movement at a time, holding Nomi close, the child still half asleep but no longer shivering, her small hand gripping the edge of the coat as if it belonged to her now. And when Sarah reached the surface, she paused, not moving away immediately, not retreating, just standing there in the open space of the barn, looking at him as if trying to understand something that did not fit into the rules she knew. The light had changed fully now, morning filling the barn with a soft gray that revealed everything as it was, the worn beams, the patched walls, the heater running low, the thin line of frost still clinging to the edges of the floor, and in that light, nothing about the place looked like it could protect anyone, and yet it had. Caleb moved to the heater, adjusting it down slightly, saving what little fuel remained, then turned back toward them, his hands falling loosely at his sides, not reaching, not offering anything more than presence. Sarah shifted her weight, her gaze moving around the barn once more before returning to him, and when she spoke, the translation unit caught her clearly this time. No hesitation, no broken fragments. "You could have given us to them." And there was no accusation in it, only statement. Only truth. Caleb nodded once. Yeah, he replied. Simple, unguarded, and she studied him for a long moment after that, her eyes searching for something deeper, something hidden, but finding only what was already there. A man who had made a choice and did not feel the need to explain it. Nomi stirred in her arms then, blinking slowly as she looked around the barn, her gaze settling briefly on Caleb, curious, unafraid, and she reached out slightly, her small fingers opening and closing in the air as if testing something she could not name. Caleb did not step forward, did not close the distance. He only gave a faint, almost uncertain nod in return, and for a second, the space between them felt lighter, not empty, but no longer heavy with doubt. Outside, the first rays of real sunlight broke through the thinning clouds, spilling across the fields and reflecting off the snow in a way that softened everything it touched, and that light crept into the barn, catching on the edges of Sarah's form, on the small outline of Nomi in her arms, and for just a moment, the scene held still, balanced between what had been and what would come next. Sarah adjusted her hold on the child and took a small step toward the door, then paused again, turning back just enough to meet his eyes one last time. And she did not say thank you, not in words, not in any language the unit could translate. But she did not need to, because what she left behind in that look was clearer than anything spoken. Caleb watched as she stepped into the morning light, the snow crunching softly beneath her feet as she moved away from the barn, not looking back again. And he remained where he was, standing in the doorway of a place that had been nothing more than a structure the day before, and something else entirely now. He exhaled slowly, the breath visible for just a second in the cold air, and as the light spread further across the fields, he glanced down at the faint, small impressions in the snow where Nomi's feet had touched the ground, and for a moment, just a moment, the world felt a little less cold than it had the night before.